In the mist-shrouded territories where ancient werewolf bloodlines rule with iron claws and silver tongues, there exists a truth darker than the moonless nights that haunt these cursed lands. Power corrupts, loyalty bleeds, but family destroys everything it touches. This is the tale of Commander Dorian Blackthorn, a beta whose violet eyes have witnessed horrors that would break lesser minds, whose unwavering loyalty has been tested in ways that forge legends or destroy souls. They called him the Shadow Commander, not for his stealth in battle, though he moved through darkness like a wraith given flesh, but for the shadows that seemed to follow him wherever his cursed duty led. The werewolf kingdom of Aldris had known 3 centuries of relative peace under the iron rule of Alpha King Thaddeus Ironmaw, a monarch whose strength was legendary even among a race of supernatural predators. But for the past year, that strength had been failing, consumed by a curse so insidious that it turned the king's own power against him, feeding on his life force like a parasite that grew stronger with each passing day. 7 healers had tried to break the curse. 7 had died screaming, their bodies found drained of life, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. The palace crypts now held their bones, picked clean by the very darkness they had sought to heal, serving as a grim reminder that some wounds go deeper than flesh and blood. Tonight, we delve into the burden that Commander Dorian carried, the mission that would shatter kingdoms, the family secret that threatened to consume everything he held sacred, and the choice that would define not just his fate, but the future of every soul who dwelled in the shadow of the throne. The curse that plagued the Alpha King wasn't random. You see, it was personal. It was precise. It was crafted with the intimate knowledge that only comes from blood ties and broken trust. And Commander Dorian Blackthorn was about to discover just how personal it truly was. As you listen to this tale unfold, ask yourself, when blood calls to blood across the void of years and betrayal, when duty demands sacrifice of everything you hold dear, which voice do you follow? The voice of honor that has guided your every step, or the whisper of kinship that promises both salvation and damnation in equal measure? Thunder rolls ominously in the distance, and something howls in the night. For in the end, we all must choose between the families we're born into and the families we swear to serve. And sometimes, those choices carry consequences that echo through generations yet unborn. Chapter 1. The Cottage of Desperation. The autumn morning clung to the decrepit cottage like the breath of the dying, and Commander Dorian Blackthorn stood in its overgrown garden, his imposing 6-foot frame cutting through the fog like a blade through silk. His violet eyes, those unsettling windows to a soul burdened by decades of unwavering service to the crown, surveyed the scene before him with the calculated precision of a predator who had learned that survival often depended on reading the desperation in other people's faces. This was the kind of place where hope came to die. The cottage squatted in a clearing 20 miles from the nearest village, its walls sagging under the weight of neglect and poverty. Paint peeled from its timber like diseased skin, and the thatched roof leaked in a dozen places, creating stains on the interior walls that looked disturbingly like bloodstains in the early morning light. The garden, once perhaps a source of pride for its owners, had long since surrendered to weeds and thorns that seemed to reach toward visitors with grasping, desperate fingers. Yet it was here, in this forgotten corner of the realm, where even the tax collectors feared to tread, that the Alpha King's last hope supposedly dwelled. Here, among the ruins of a family's shattered dreams, lived the 8th healer who claimed she could succeed where 7 others had failed so catastrophically. Dorian had read the reports during his 3-day journey from the capital. Lionel Moonshadow, an omega of common birth whose healing abilities had supposedly manifested in ways that defied traditional understanding. Unlike the court physicians with their rigid training and documented techniques, she worked with instinct and intuition, channeling power that seemed to flow from sources that the learned masters claimed didn't exist. The reports also mentioned her marks, silver patterns beneath her skin that pulsed with their own light, growing brighter when her abilities were active. Such markings were rare, appearing perhaps once in a generation, and their presence usually indicated either extraordinary potential or extraordinary danger. Standing here now, surrounded by the cottage's aura of desperation and decay, Dorian suspected it might be both. The negotiation begins with underlying menace. "The Omega," Dorian announced, his voice rolling across the garden like distant thunder. Each syllable carried the weight of royal authority, the kind of tone that had silenced rebellion and commanded respect in a dozen different courts. The very air seemed to tremble in response, and the morning birds fell silent, as if recognizing the presence of an apex predator. She emerged from the cottage's shadowed doorway like a vision from a fever dream. Lyanna Moonshadow, the marked healer whose reputation had somehow reached even the marble halls of the Crystal Palace. Her appearance was striking in ways that went beyond mere physical beauty. She stood perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, with the kind of ethereal grace that suggested elven blood somewhere in her ancestry. Her silver hair fell in waves to her waist, catching the morning light and reflecting it in patterns that seemed to shift and dance with each movement. But it was the marks that truly set her apart from any healer Dorian had ever encountered. Silver patterns pulsed beneath her pale skin like living tattoos, creating intricate designs that seemed to tell a story written in a language older than human civilization. The markings covered her arms from wrist to shoulder, traced delicate spirals around her throat, and disappeared beneath the simple brown dress she wore, suggesting that they might cover far more of her body than was immediately visible. Where any reasonable person might have cowered before the Shadow Commander's intimidating presence, she stood tall, her chin lifted in defiance that bordered on the suicidal. Her silver eyes, an unusual genetic trait that matched the color of her marks, met his violet gaze without flinching, as if she were evaluating him just as thoroughly as he was studying her. "I carry life, Commander," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. "It simply appears as death to those who lack the vision to understand its true nature." Dorian began to circle her slowly, his military boots crunching on the frost-covered ground with the measured rhythm of a predator testing its prey. Each step was deliberate, calculated to assess her from every angle while demonstrating the futility of any attempt to flee. The energy that radiated from her was unlike anything he'd encountered in his 37 years of life. Ancient and primal, tinged with something that made his enhanced werewolf senses recoil in instinctive warning. She reminded him of someone. The realization struck him like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd spent 15 years trying to bury. Another young woman with power that seemed to flow from impossible sources, whose presence had made the air itself seem charged with dangerous potential. His sister, Seraphina, had possessed that same otherworldly aura before she vanished into the night, leaving behind only a note about greater purposes and the ashes of experiments that had burned away the family's honor. Flashback sequence. Dorian's memories surface. 22 years earlier, Blackthorn Manor. Young Dorian, barely 15 and still growing into his eventual height and strength, had discovered his 12-year-old sister in the manor's abandoned East Tower, surrounded by books that their parents had forbidden her to read. Seraphina sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, her violet eyes, identical to his own, blazing with concentration as she traced symbols in the air with her fingertips. Where her fingers passed, silver fire followed, hanging suspended in space like frozen lightning. The sight was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a display of raw power that no child should have been able to command. "Sarah, what are you doing?" he had whispered, afraid to speak too loudly lest he break whatever delicate balance she was maintaining. She looked up at him with those unsettling eyes, and when she smiled, it was with the kind of satisfaction that spoke of secrets too heavy for a child to carry. "Learning, brother. The masters at court teach fear and limitation, but the old books, they teach truth. Power isn't meant to be caged by tradition and ceremony. It's meant to flow like water, to shape and change according to will and necessity. Father says the old magic is dangerous, that it corrupts those who use it." Seraphina's laugh had been like silver bells ringing in a graveyard. "Father says many things, Dorian, but ask yourself, if the old magic is so dangerous, why do the alphas work so hard to keep it from reaching common hands? Why do they guard the ancient texts like treasures while teaching watered-down techniques to everyone else?" The silver fire had pulsed brighter as she spoke, responding to the passion in her voice. They fear what they can't control. They fear that someone like us, someone born to beta rank but carrying the blood of the first wolves, might rise above our station and challenge the natural order. That conversation had haunted Dorian for years, especially after Seraphina's disappearance had torn their family apart. Now, looking at Lyanna Moonshadow and her silver marks, he felt the echo of that ancient fear stirring in his chest once again. Back to the present. The negotiation intensifies. Bold words, Dorian murmured, his voice carrying a hint of something that might have been approval or warning. The king's curse has already claimed 7 healers who spoke with similar confidence. Their bones now decorate the palace crypts, picked clean by the very darkness they thought to heal. Their final screams echo through the crystal halls as a reminder of the price of overconfidence. Lyanna's marks flared brighter at his words, casting ethereal shadows across her face that seemed to shift and dance with a life of their own. Rather than being intimidated by his grim description, she seemed to draw strength from it, standing even straighter as if his challenge had awakened something dormant within her. Then perhaps His Majesty's curse requires someone who has already made peace with death, Commander. Someone who understands that healing and dying are often 2 faces of the same coin, and that sometimes salvation can only come through sacrifice. Her words carried a weight that went beyond mere bravado. There was genuine pain in her voice, the kind of deep, abiding sorrow that spoke of losses that had carved permanent scars on her soul. Dorian found himself genuinely curious about what tragedies had shaped this strange young woman, what experiences had given her the courage to volunteer for what was essentially an elaborate form of suicide. The family's desperation becomes clear. The cottage door creaked open on hinges that screamed in protest, and Lyanna's father emerged, clutching a scroll in hands that trembled with a combination of fear and desperate hope. Gareth Moonshadow was a broken man, hollow-eyed and gaunt to the point of starvation, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once carried more flesh. The scent of sickness clung to him like a shroud, the distinctive odor of someone whose body was consuming itself in the absence of adequate nutrition. Behind him came Lyanna's mother, Elena, a woman who might once have been beautiful but was now worn down to bone and sinew by years of struggle and want. Her eyes were red-rimmed from weeping, and her hand repressed to her mouth as if physically holding back the sobs that threatened to escape. The sight of her daughter, standing calmly before the Shadow Commander, seemed to break something inside her as she sagged against the doorframe, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. The contrast between the family's desperation and Lyanna's serene acceptance was stark and deeply unsettling. Here were people who had been ground down by circumstances beyond their control, reduced to trading their daughter's life for the promise of gold that might keep them fed for a few more months. Yet Lyanna herself showed no resentment, no anger at being treated as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. "The contract," Gareth said, his voice barely above a whisper as he extended the scroll toward Dorian with shaking hands. "Everything you requested is here. Bloodline documentation, magical aptitude records, health certificates, everything required by royal decree." Dorian accepted the scroll and unrolled it with practiced efficiency, his eyes scanning the dense legal text that would transfer ownership of Lyanna's person from her family to the crown. It was written in the old tongue, with binding runes woven throughout the parchment that would make the agreement magically enforceable. Once signed and sealed, Lyanna would belong to the kingdom as completely as any piece of property, her fate entirely at the discretion of her royal masters. The terms were generous by the standards of such agreements. The family would receive enough gold to purchase a new cottage in a more prosperous region, along with sufficient funds to establish Gareth in a trade that might support them for the rest of their lives. In exchange, they were surrendering all claims to their daughter, acknowledging that she might never return and accepting that her life was forfeit the moment she stepped into the king's presence. The magical binding ceremony. "The blood seal," Dorian said, producing a silver dagger whose blade gleamed with an otherworldly light. The weapon was ancient, forged in the early days of the kingdom when the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits was thinner than gossamer. Its edge could cut through magical barriers as easily as flesh, making it the perfect tool for creating bindings that would hold even against supernatural resistance. Gareth extended his hand without hesitation, palm upward, and Dorian drew the blade across his weathered skin in a single, precise motion. Blood welled up immediately, not the bright red of healthy circulation, but the dark, sluggish flow of someone whose body was slowly shutting down from malnutrition and stress. The moment Gareth's blood touched the parchment, the runes blazed alive with silver fire that made everyone present wince and shield their eyes. The magic of the binding settled into the document like a living thing, sealing the agreement with power that reached across the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. "It is done," Dorian announced, rolling the contract and securing it within his leather satchel. "Lady Moonshadow now belongs to the crown. You have 5 minutes to say your farewells." The cryptic warning. As Lyanna gathered her few possessions, a worn traveling cloak that had belonged to her grandmother, a leather satchel containing various herbs and mysterious instruments whose purposes Dorian could only guess at, and a silver pendant that seemed to hum with its own internal energy, an ancient figure emerged from the cottage's depths. This was Morgana Whisperwind, the village's eldest healer, and a woman whose reputation for uncanny knowledge extended far beyond the boundaries of this remote region. She moved with the careful steps of someone whose bones ached with every movement, but her eyes were sharp and knowing despite her obvious age. Some said she had lived for over a century, accumulating wisdom and secrets that she shared only when the need was desperate enough to warrant the risk. She approached Lyanna with obvious reluctance, as if every step brought her closer to some terrible precipice that she couldn't avoid but desperately wanted to. In her gnarled hands, she carried a small crystal vial filled with liquid that seemed to shift colors in the morning light. Sometimes clear as water, sometimes dark as blood, sometimes shimmering with an oily rainbow sheen that hurt to look at directly. "Child," she whispered, her voice like autumn leaves rustling in a graveyard, "take this. When the truth becomes too heavy to bear alone, when the choice must be made between salvation and sacrifice, drink what lies within. But know that some remedies cure one poison only by introducing another." She pressed the vial into Lyanna's palm, and Dorian saw both women shudder as their skin made contact. For a moment, silver fire seemed to arc between them, and the air filled with the scent of ozone and burning herbs. Then the moment passed, and Morgana stepped back with tears streaming down her ancient cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though Dorian couldn't tell if she was addressing Lyanna, her parents, or some unseen presence that only she could perceive. "I'm so very sorry for what we've set in motion." Before Dorian could question the exchange, his lieutenant approached with news that the convoy was ready to depart. 6 black carriages waited beyond the village outskirts, each one a masterwork of craftsmanship designed to withstand both physical attacks and magical interference. The horses were war-bred destriers whose coats gleamed like polished obsidian, and the guards wore the midnight blue armor of the king's personal cavalry, their faces hidden behind helmets that had been blessed by the court's high priests. The departure, no looking back. Dorian took Lyanna's arm in a grip that was firm but not cruel, guiding her toward the waiting convoy with the efficiency of long practice. She moved with a fluid grace that spoke of noble breeding despite her humble circumstances, and she didn't look back as the cottage and her weeping family disappeared into the morning mist. The lead carriage was a marvel of luxury and security, its interior appointed with rich burgundy velvet cushions and silver fixtures that caught and reflected light in mesmerizing patterns. The windows were made of crystal, so clear it seemed invisible until the light struck at precisely the right angle. And protective runes had been carved into every surface to ward off both physical and magical attacks. As they settled into their seats across from each other, Dorian opened his leather-bound journal and began making notes in the precise, military script that had served him throughout his career. Mission Law Day 1. Subject: Lion Moonshadow, Omega Class, Marked Healer. Physical description: 5 feet 6 inches, silver hair, silver eyes, extensive marking coverage. Demeanor: defiant but controlled. No obvious signs of fear, highly unusual. Magical signature: unknown classification. Marks responsive to emotional state. Special observations: energy pattern reminiscent of. His pen paused over the page as unwelcome memories threatened to surface. The resemblance between this marked Omega and his vanished sister went beyond mere physical appearance. There was something in the way she carried herself, in the quiet confidence that spoke of hidden depths of power that she had only barely learned to control. But Serafina was dead, had been dead for 15 years, killed in a hunting accident that the family had never spoken about publicly. To suggest otherwise, even in his private notes, felt like a betrayal of the grief they had all carried for so many years. The journey's foreboding atmosphere. As the convoy began its journey through the countryside, winding along roads that grew progressively more wild and dangerous as they moved away from civilized settlements, Dorian found his attention divided between his official duties and the growing sense of unease that seemed to follow them like a persistent shadow. The landscape they traveled through was beautiful in an alien way. Ancient forests where the trees grew in patterns that suggested intelligence behind their placement, meadows where the grass grew in spirals that made the eye ache to follow them, streams that flowed uphill in defiance of natural law. This was the borderland between the kingdom proper and the wild territories where magic still ran strong and strange, where the old powers that had shaped the world in its youth still held dominion over reality itself. Lioness sat in tense silence, her marks now maintaining a constant, low-level glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat. Every few minutes, she would tilt her head slightly, as if listening to a conversation that only she could hear, and her silver eyes would grow distant with concentration. "You're hearing something," Dorian observed after they had been traveling for several hours. It wasn't a question. His enhanced senses could detect the subtle changes in her breathing, the way her pulse quickened when whatever she was listening to grew more intense. "The land speaks here," she replied quietly, her voice carrying a note of wonder tinged with fear. In the civilized areas, the voices are muted, filtered through layers of human influence and controlled magic. But out here, where the old powers still run strong, they're singing, Commander. Singing of changes coming, of ancient bargains finally coming due, of... She paused, her expression troubled. Of family reunions that will shake the foundations of kingdoms. As if summoned by her words, a shadow detached itself from the treeline ahead. A figure on horseback whose violet eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence in the fading daylight, and whose laugh carried across the distance like the sound of glass breaking in a cathedral. Chapter 2: Shadows on the Road. The atmosphere grows more ominous and threatening. The convoy rolled through increasingly treacherous terrain as the first day of their journey progressed. The well-maintained roads of the kingdom's heartland giving way to ancient paths that seemed to shift and change when no one was looking directly at them. The horses grew restless, their ears constantly swiveling toward sounds that the human members of the party couldn't quite hear, and even the most experienced guards began muttering prayers to gods whose names hadn't been spoken openly in generations. Dorian watched the landscape pass by with growing unease, his enhanced senses picking up details that painted a disturbing picture of their journey's true nature. The trees along the roadside bore scars that looked suspiciously like claw marks, but far too large to have been made by any natural creature. Strange birds with too many eyes watched their passage from branches that seemed to bend toward the convoy, as if drawn by some invisible force. Most troubling of all were the shadows. They moved wrong, independent of the light sources that should have controlled them, flowing like dark water across the ground and up the sides of trees in patterns that suggested intelligence and malevolent purpose. Inside the carriage, Lina had grown increasingly agitated as the day wore on. Her marks pulsed more rapidly now, casting flickering silver light across the velvet interior that made both their faces appear ghostly and ethereal. She kept pressing her hands to her temples as if trying to block out sounds that were growing too loud to bear. "They're calling to me," she whispered suddenly, her voice tight with strain. The shadows, the voices in the wind, something deep underground that's been sleeping for centuries but is starting to wake up. "They know what I am, Commander. They know what I was made to do." Dorian leaned forward, his journal forgotten in his lap. "What do you mean, what you were made to do?" Before she could answer, a horn sounded from the front of the convoy. 2 long blasts followed by 3 short ones, the signal for immediate danger ahead. The carriage lurched to a halt so suddenly that both occupants were thrown forward in their seats, and outside they could hear the sound of weapons being drawn and orders being shouted in the crisp, professional tones of soldiers preparing for battle. The mysterious encounter. Dorian was out of the carriage before it had fully stopped moving, his hand already on his sword hilt as he assessed the situation with the automatic efficiency of decades spent in military service. His guards had formed a defensive perimeter around the convoy, their weapons gleaming in the fading afternoon light. But their target was unlike anything he had encountered in his years of service to the crown. A single figure sat motionless on horseback, perhaps 50 yards ahead, silhouetted against the darkening sky like a statue carved from shadow itself. The horse was magnificent, a destrier of obvious supernatural breeding whose coat seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and whose eyes glowed with the same violet fire that marked the ancient bloodlines of the kingdom's nobility. But it was the rider that made Dorian's blood turn to ice in his veins. He was tall and lean, dressed in robes that seemed to shift between black and midnight blue, depending on the angle of observation. His hair was silver white despite his apparent youth, and it flowed around his shoulders like liquid moonlight. But it was his eyes that confirmed Dorian's worst fears. Violet orbs identical to his own, carrying the unmistakable genetic signature of the Blackthorn bloodline. Cassius Blackthorn, his uncle, dead and buried 20 years ago, according to official records, smiled at him across the distance with an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "Nephew," Cassius called, his voice carrying with unnatural clarity despite the distance between them. "You've grown into the Shadow Commander role admirably. Your father would be proud to see how well you've learned to balance duty and deception." Dorian's lieutenant, Marcus Ironheart, stepped up beside him with his crossbow already loaded and aimed at the mysterious figure. "Commander, your orders?" For a moment, Dorian considered giving the command to fire. Cassius Blackthorn had been exiled from the kingdom for practicing forbidden magic, his name struck from the family records, and his existence officially denied by royal decree. If he had somehow survived the exile that was supposed to have been a death sentence, his presence here could only mean trouble of the highest magnitude. But something in his uncle's bearing, a casual confidence that suggested he held all the advantages in this encounter, made Dorian hesitate. Men who appeared fearless in the face of a dozen armed soldiers usually had good reasons for their confidence. "Hold your positions," he commanded quietly. "Let me speak with him." The family revelation begins. Dorian walked forward slowly, his hand still resting on his sword hilt, but not drawing the weapon. Every instinct he possessed screamed warnings about the magical energy radiating from his uncle, but curiosity and a desperate need for answers drove him forward despite the danger. "Uncle," he said when he was close enough to speak without shouting, "the family was told you died in exile. Apparently, we were misinformed." Cassius's laugh was like the sound of wind chimes made from human bones. "Dead to the family, perhaps. Dead to the kingdom, certainly. But death and exile are not always the same thing, nephew. I've spent 20 years learning that lesson in ways that would horrify your noble sensibilities." Up close, Dorian could see that his uncle's apparent youth was an illusion created by magic so subtle that it was almost undetectable. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of decades of strain, and his hands bore scars that could only have been earned through trafficking with powers that exacted a physical price for their use. "Why are you here?" Dorian demanded. "Why now, after all these years?" "Because the game our family has been playing for generations is finally reaching its conclusion," And you, dutiful, loyal, honorable Dorian, are about to become the most important piece on the board. Cassius dismounted with fluid grace, his feet making no sound as they touched the ground. The shadows around him seemed to deepen and writhe, reaching toward Dorian like grasping fingers before pulling back, as if commanded. Tell me, nephew, what do you know of the Alpha King's curse? I know it's killed 7 healers and grows stronger each day. I know I've been tasked with delivering an Omega who claims she can break it. And have you wondered why this particular Omega? Why now, when dozens of more experienced healers have failed so spectacularly? The question hung in the air between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Dorian felt the familiar weight of duty warring with the growing certainty that he was walking blind into a trap that had been years in the making. The terrible truth about the curse. The curse that plagues your king was not cast by some random enemy or foreign sorceress. Cassius continued, his words falling like hammer blows on Dorian's consciousness. It was crafted by someone with intimate knowledge of the royal bloodline, someone who understood the precise resonance patterns needed to target the strongest alpha in the kingdom and turn his own power against him. Dorian felt his world beginning to tilt on its axis. Someone from our bloodline, someone with violet eyes and a gift for weaving shadows into substance. Someone who learned the forbidden arts well enough to create a curse that could bring the most powerful werewolf in the kingdom to his knees and make it look like a natural illness. The name hung unspoken between them, but Dorian could see the confirmation in his uncle's eyes. Seraphina, his sister, who had vanished 15 years ago with nothing but a cryptic note about greater purposes and family honor. She's alive, he said, the words torn from his throat like a confession that damned them both. Very much so. And the Omega you're carrying to the palace is not meant to break the curse, nephew. She's meant to complete it. The horrible scope of the conspiracy. Cassius began to circle Dorian slowly, his movements echoing those of a predator toying with cornered prey. With each step, more details of the conspiracy spilled from his lips like poison from a broken vial. Seraphina's original curse was brilliant, but incomplete. It could wound the king, weaken him, make him vulnerable to influences that would normally never penetrate his mental defenses. But she needed a catalyst, someone with the right combination of power and innocence to serve as a conduit for the curse's final phase. The pieces began falling into place in Dorian's mind with horrifying clarity. The Omega's strange marks, her unusual abilities, the way she seemed to drain something essential from the creatures she healed while appearing to save them. Lyanna, he whispered. The marked Omega, yes. Her silver patterns aren't signs of divine blessing, Dorian. They're a beacon, calling to the curse and preparing her body to channel its completion. When she reaches the palace, when she touches the king in the name of healing him. Cassius shrugged eloquently. The curse will flow through her like water through a broken dam and finish what Seraphina started 15 years ago. The implications hit Dorian like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. He wasn't delivering salvation to his king. He was bringing the weapon that would destroy him. Every mile they traveled brought them closer to completing his sister's revenge, and he had been too blind to see the truth until it was almost too late to matter. What? The word escaped him as barely more than a whisper. Why would she do this to the king? To the kingdom? To us? Cassius's expression softened slightly, carrying an echo of the uncle who had once taught young Dorian to ride and hunt in the forest surrounding Blackthorn Manor. Because the Alphas destroyed our family first, nephew. Because they fear our bloodline's power and have worked for generations to keep us subservient, to ensure that we never rise above our appointed station. The family's hidden history. You think your sister's exile was about forbidden magic? About experiments that went too far? Cassius shook his head sadly. Seraphina's only crime was having the courage to reach for power that the Alphas wanted to keep for themselves. Her research into the old magics, her attempts to unlock the true potential of our bloodline. These were threats to a system that depends on keeping betas weak and grateful for whatever scraps of authority we're permitted. The shadows around them grew deeper as Cassius spoke, and Dorian realized that night was falling with unnatural speed. The temperature had dropped significantly, and frost was beginning to form on the grass, despite the fact that it was still early autumn. "Your father knew the truth," Cassius continued. "He knew that Seraphina's exile was really execution by another name, that sending her into the wild territories without resources or protection was meant to be a death sentence that would look like an accident. But he chose duty over blood, just as you're choosing now." Dorian's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "And what would you have had him do? Declare war on the crown? Rebel against the natural order of things? Our family has served the kingdom loyally for 300 years. We are what we are because of that service. We are what we are because we've been bred to accept limitations that were imposed on us by those who feared what we might become if we ever stopped accepting them," Cassius replied. But Seraphina refused to accept those limitations. She saw the potential that runs in our blood, the power to command shadows, to weave curses and blessings with equal skill, to stand as equals to the alphas who claim divine right to rule over us. "The choice is presented. You have a decision to make, nephew," Cassius said, his voice taking on a formal tone that suggested ritual significance. "You can continue to the palace and watch your king die, fulfilling a duty that will ultimately serve your sister's revenge while destroying everything you claim to value. Or you can choose blood over oath and help us complete what we started on our own terms." Dorian felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him like a mountain. "And if I refuse both options, then you doom everyone you claim to serve. The curse will complete itself regardless of your cooperation. Seraphina has spent 15 years ensuring that every contingency has been accounted for. But without our guidance, without the restraint that comes from family loyalty, it will spread beyond the king to consume the entire royal bloodline and every noble house that has ever shown our family disrespect." The carriage door opened behind them, and Lyanna stepped into the rapidly cooling night air despite Dorian's earlier command to remain inside. Her marks were now blazing with silver fire, so bright they cast shadows of their own, and her eyes reflected the light like mirrors that had learned to think for themselves. "He speaks the truth," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of unwelcome revelation. "I can feel it now. The curse's call growing stronger with every mile we travel toward the palace. It's like a song in my blood, a melody that promises power beyond imagination if I just surrender to its rhythm." She looked between Dorian and Cassius, understanding dawning in her expression like sunrise over a battlefield. "I'm not meant to heal the king, am I? I'm meant to transform him into something that can be controlled, something that will serve your sisters well instead of the kingdom's needs." Cassius nodded approvingly. "The child understands. The curse I helped Seraphina craft doesn't simply kill, nephew. It binds and transforms, turning the victim into a vessel for the caster's will. When channeled through the proper conduit, it will not destroy the Alpha King. It will make him into Seraphina's puppet, dancing to whatever tune she chooses to play." As Cassius finished speaking, the shadows around them began to coalesce into familiar forms, and from their depths came the sound of slow, deliberate applause. A voice that Dorian hadn't heard in 15 years echoed across the clearing. "Hello, dear brother. I've been waiting so very long for our reunion." Chapter 3: The Sisters' Web. The atmosphere becomes electric with dangerous magic. Seraphina Blackthorn stepped out of the shadows, as if she had been woven from darkness itself. Her appearance both exactly as Dorian remembered and utterly transformed by 15 years of trafficking with powers that no mortal was meant to command. She moved with the fluid grace of something that had learned to hunt in dimensions where the normal rules of physics were merely suggestions. And when she smiled, the expression carried the weight of secrets that could unravel the fabric of reality itself. She was beautiful in the way that cursed things are beautiful, compelling and terrible in equal measure, with an otherworldly presence that made the air around her shimmer with barely contained energy. Her dark hair fell in waves that seemed to move independent of any wind, and she wore robes of deepest violet that appeared to be cut from the night sky itself, complete with stars that twinkled and shifted position as she moved. But it was her eyes that struck Dorian like a physical blow. They were still the same violet shade that marked the Blackthorn bloodline, but now they held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of her skull. When she looked at him, he felt as if she were seeing not just his present form, but every moment of his life simultaneously. Past, present, and potential futures spreading out before her like an open book written in a language only she could read. Seraphina. Her name fell from his lips like a prayer and a curse combined, carrying 15 years of grief and guilt and desperate hope that crystallized into that single word. The sound seemed to hang in the air between them, vibrating with emotional resonance that made the shadows around them pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The reunion becomes a psychological battleground. "You look magnificent, brother," she said, gliding forward with predatory grace that reminded him uncomfortably of the way apex predators moved just before they struck their killing blow. "The years have been more than kind to you. Commander of the Royal Guard, trusted confidant of the king, respected throughout the realm as the Shadow Commander whose loyalty is absolute and whose word is bond. Father would have been so proud to see what his dutiful son accomplished." The casual mention of their father, dead these past 5 years, having carried the grief of Seraphina's supposed death to his own grave, hit Dorian like a blade between the ribs. Their father had never recovered from losing his daughter, had spent his final years as a broken man who jumped at every shadow and started at every unexpected sound, always hoping that she might somehow return to them. "He grieved for you until the day he died," Dorian said, his voice rough with emotion that he couldn't entirely suppress. "We all did. We held funeral rites. We mourned her passing. We erected a memorial stone in the family cemetery. For 15 years, we believed you were dead." Seraphina's laugh was like silver bells ringing in a cathedral built for forgotten gods. "You believed I was dead because that was easier than admitting that your precious duty had driven away the one person in the family who possessed real power. But I forgive you, Dorian. I understand why you chose the crown over blood, why you stood by and watched as they condemned me to exile that was meant to be a death sentence. It's what you were trained to do from birth." She circled him slowly, her movements echoing those of their shared uncle, but carrying an additional layer of predatory assessment that made Dorian's wolf instinct scream warnings he couldn't afford to heed. With each step, the temperature seemed to drop another degree, and frost began forming on the ground in intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like the binding runes used in the most forbidden magical practices. "But tell me, brother, in all these years of faithful service, have you ever wondered what would have happened if our family had chosen a different path? If we had embraced our true potential instead of allowing ourselves to be caged by tradition and ceremony?" Lioness' true nature is revealed. Lioness stood pressed against the side of the carriage, her marks now pulsing so brightly they cast dancing shadows across her face and made her appear almost ethereal. But where before the silver patterns had seemed beautiful and otherworldly, now they carried an ominous quality that spoke of power barely contained beneath fragile mortal flesh. "She knows," Lioness said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of terrible certainty. "She's known from the moment I was born. The marks, the abilities, the way I drain something essential from everything I heal. It was all part of her design." Seraphina turned her attention to the Omega with obvious satisfaction, like an artist admiring a particularly complex masterpiece that had taken years to complete. "Such a clever girl. Yes, I've been watching you since you were a child, guiding your development, ensuring that your power matured in precisely the ways necessary for my grand design." She extended one hand toward Lioness, and silver fire arced between them. Not the gentle healing light that Lioness typically manifested, but something darker and more purposeful that made the air itself seem to recoil in fear. "Your parents thought they were blessed when their daughter manifested healing abilities," Seraphina continued, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather. "They never suspected that I had been the one to arrange their meeting, to ensure that the proper bloodlines combined to produce exactly the catalyst I required. Dorian felt his world tilting on its axis as the full scope of his sister's manipulation became clear. You orchestrated her birth. Her entire life has been a carefully crafted tool designed for one specific purpose. Yes. The silver marks aren't a sign of divine blessing, brother. They're a map, a guide that will allow the curse I planted in the Alpha King to find its way into a vessel capable of channeling its final form. The curse's true nature is explained. Seraphina began to pace around the small clearing, her movements causing the shadows to writhe and dance in patterns that hurt to look at directly. As she spoke, her voice took on the cadence of a professor delivering a lecture on subjects that no university would ever dare to teach. The curse currently afflicting our beloved king is elegant in its complexity. It feeds on his own strength, growing more powerful with each day that passes while appearing to be nothing more than a wasting illness that baffles the court physicians. But that was always meant to be only the first phase. She gestured toward Lyanna, whose marks were now responding to Seraphina's presence with increasing intensity. When our little catalyst reaches the palace and lays her hands upon the king in the name of healing him, the curse will recognize its intended vessel and flow through her like water through a broken dam. But instead of killing him, it will transform him into something far more useful. Dorian's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of his guards shifting nervously in their positions, clearly uncomfortable with the magical energies swirling around them, but unwilling to abandon their posts without direct orders. The horses were growing increasingly restless, their enhanced animal instincts recognizing the presence of predators that existed on a level far above anything they had evolved to understand. "What kind of transformation?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that will give me absolute control over the most powerful werewolf in the kingdom," Seraphina replied with obvious satisfaction. "Once the curse completes its work, King Thaddeus will retain all of his strength, all of his authority, all of his influence. But his will, his decision-making capacity, his very sense of identity will belong entirely to me." The scope of the conspiracy becomes clear. "Imagine it, brother," she continued, her eyes blazing with fanatical intensity. "An Alpha King who appears completely normal to outside observers, but who follows my commands with absolute obedience. Through him, I can reshape the entire kingdom according to my vision. I can elevate our family to the position we should have held all along, can strip power from those who have kept us subjugated for centuries, can create a new order where strength of will matters more than accident of birth." Cassius nodded approvingly from his position near the tree lean, his own violet eyes reflecting the silver fire that continued to arc between Seraphina and Lyanna. "The girl understands her role now. The question is whether you do, nephew. Will you continue to serve masters who have never appreciated your true worth? Or will you finally choose to stand with your blood family?" Dorian looked around the clearing, taking in the full tableau of his impossible situation. His sister returned from 15 years of exile with power that defied comprehension and a plan that could reshape the political landscape of the entire kingdom. His uncle, supposedly dead but very much alive and clearly complicit in whatever conspiracy had been brewing in the shadows all these years. An Omega healer who was actually a living weapon designed to complete a curse that would turn his king into a puppet dancing to his sister's will. And himself, caught between duty and blood, between loyalty and love, between the oath he had sworn to serve the crown and the family ties that had shaped his earliest memories and deepest loyalties. Lyanna's internal struggle intensifies. "I can feel it building," Lyanna said suddenly, her voice tight with strain as she pressed her hands to her temples. "The closer we get to the palace, the stronger the pull becomes. It's like there's something inside me that's waking up, something that's been sleeping since I was born and is finally ready to fulfill its purpose." Her marks were now pulsing in perfect synchronization with the rhythm of her heartbeat, and where the silver patterns were brightest, her skin had begun to take on a translucent quality that revealed the network of power flowing beneath the surface like luminous blood. "The pain is getting worse too," she continued, her words coming in short gasps, as if speaking required enormous effort. Every time I use my abilities, every creature I heal, it takes something from me and gives something back that doesn't belong in a human body. I can feel myself changing, becoming something that isn't entirely mortal anymore. Seraphina approached the suffering Omega with what might have been sympathy, if not for the calculating gleam in her violet eyes. The transformation is necessary, child. Mortal flesh cannot channel the kind of power required to complete my work. You're becoming something greater than human, a perfect conduit for energies that exist beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. And when it's over, Lyanna asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. When the curse is complete and the king is under your control, what happens to me? The silence that followed was answer enough. Seraphina had spent 15 years crafting the perfect weapon, but weapons were ultimately disposable once they had served their purpose. The family history is rewritten. You want to know why I'm doing this? Seraphina asked, turning back to address Dorian directly. You want to understand what could drive me to such extremes? Then let me tell you the real story of our family's history, not the sanitized version you learned from Father's carefully edited bedtime stories. She gestured, and shadows began to form images in the air around them. Scenes from the past rendered in darkness and silver fire that showed events from perspectives that official histories had never recorded. The Blackthorn bloodline is older than the current royal house by 3 centuries, she began, her voice taking on the cadence of ritual incantation. We were among the founding families of this kingdom, equal partners in the great work of building a civilization that could stand against the chaos of the wild territories. The shadow images showed werewolves with violet eyes standing alongside the earliest Alpha Kings, their power and authority clearly equal to that of the rulers they served. But as the scenes progressed through the centuries, the Blackthorn representatives gradually moved from positions beside the throne to positions behind it, their status diminishing with each generation until they became mere servants rather than partners. But the Alphas feared what we represented, Seraphina continued. A bloodline whose power didn't depend on dominance and physical strength, who could command forces that existed beyond the simple dynamics of pack hierarchy. They began a systematic campaign to diminish our influence, to breed subservience into our family line through carefully arranged marriages and social pressure. More images formed. Blackthorn ancestors who had challenged Alpha authority and been executed for treason, family members who had been exiled on trumped-up charges, children who had been sent away to schools from which they never returned. By the time Father's generation came to power, we had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept our subordinate status that we actually took pride in our servitude. We told ourselves that loyalty and duty were virtues, that serving faithfully would eventually be rewarded with the respect and recognition we deserved. The final image was of their father, kneeling before the current Alpha King, while a young Dorian watched from the shadows, his expression already showing the beginnings of the absolute loyalty that would define his adult life. The choice is presented with finality. I spent my exile learning the truth about what our family once was, Seraphina said, the shadow images dissolving back into ordinary darkness. I delved into the forbidden archives, studied with masters who remembered the old ways, gathered power that the Alphas thought they had successfully denied to our bloodline forever. She extended her hand toward Dorian, silver fire dancing between her fingers in patterns that seemed to reach directly into his mind and touch memories he had thought safely buried. Join me, brother. Help me complete what I started. Together, we can restore the Blackthorn name to its rightful place in the hierarchy of power. We can rule from behind the throne, guiding the kingdom according to our vision instead of dancing to the whims of those who see us as nothing more than useful servants. Cassius stepped forward as well, adding his voice to Seraphina's plea. The choice is simple, nephew. Continue serving masters who will never see you as more than a loyal dog, or claim the birthright that is yours by blood and power. Help us complete the transformation of the Alpha King, and you will stand beside us as we reshape the kingdom according to the old ways, when strength of will and magical mastery mattered more than accident of birth. Dorian looked between his sister and his uncle, then at Lyanna, who was now glowing so brightly with silver fire that looking at her directly was almost painful. The Omega's transformation was accelerating, her human features taking on an otherworldly quality that spoke of power that was rapidly outgrowing the mortal flesh that contained it. In the distance, he could hear his guards calling his name with increasing urgency, clearly aware that something momentous was happening, but unsure whether they should intervene or maintain their positions. The horses were now openly panicking, their enhanced senses detecting predators and magical energies that their instincts told them were far beyond their ability to understand or resist. As Dorian opened his mouth to give his answer, the choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the kingdom itself, a new voice cut through the night air like a blade through silk. "Commander Blackthorn, stand down immediately. By order of the crown." The sound of approaching hoofbeats thundered through the forest as royal reinforcements arrived, led by a figure whose authority even the Shadow Commander was bound to respect. Chapter 4. The Palace of Shattered Illusions. 52:0-70:00. The scene shifts to mounting tension and inevitable confrontation. The reinforcements that crashed through the forest clearing bore the golden banners of the Royal Intelligence Division, their armor gleaming with protective enchantments that made them appear to burn with cold fire in the moonlight. At their head rode Captain Elena Stormwind, the Alpha King's personal spy master and one of the few individuals in the kingdom whose authority could override even the Shadow Commander's orders. She was a woman who carried power like a second skin, tall, silver-haired despite her apparent youth, with the kind of predatory grace that spoke of decades spent hunting enemies in shadows darker than any natural darkness. Her ice-blue eyes missed nothing as they swept across the supernatural tableau before her, taking in Seraphina's otherworldly presence, Cassius's forbidden existence, and Lyanna's increasingly inhuman transformation. "Commander Blackthorn," she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who spoke directly for the crown. "Step away from the traitors and return to your duty. The king requires your immediate presence at the palace." Dorian felt the familiar weight of obligation settling back onto his shoulders, the ingrained responses of 30 years of military service warring with the emotional turmoil that his family's revelations had created. But before he could respond, Seraphina laughed, a sound like crystal breaking in a cathedral. "How delightfully predictable," she said, turning to face the new arrivals with obvious amusement. "The lapdog of the crown arrives just in time to drag my brother back to his kennel. Tell me, Captain Stormwind, do you truly believe that your dozen soldiers and their pretty enchantments can stand against power that has been 15 years in the gathering?" The magical confrontation escalates. What followed was less a battle than a demonstration of the vast gulf that separated conventional military force from the kind of power that Seraphina had learned to wield during her years in exile. She raised one hand, and shadows erupted from the ground like living things, wrapping around the legs of the royal horses and causing them to rear and panic despite their war training. Silver fire danced between her fingers as she gestured, and 3 of the soldiers found their weapons transformed into serpents that turned to strike at their wielders with venomous fangs. The protective enchantments on their armor flared and sparked as they tried to counter magic that operated according to principles their court wizards had never encountered. Captain Stormwind drew her own weapon, a blade that hummed with power and cast its own light in patterns that suggested divine blessing rather than mere magical enhancement. "In the name of Alpha King Thaddeus Ironmaw, I command you to surrender. How touching that you still believe your king has the power to command anything," Seraphina replied, her voice carrying a note of genuine pity. "By all means, Captain, return to your palace. Rush to his side and witness firsthand how far the mighty have fallen." She gestured again, and this time the magic that flowed from her fingers was not aggressive, but revelatory. Images formed in the air above them, not the shadow picture she had shown earlier, but actual visions of the Crystal Palace in real time, transmitted across the distance through methods that defied conventional understanding. The images showed the Alpha King in his private chambers, and the sight was horrifying beyond anything Dorian had imagined. The man who had once been the strongest werewolf in the kingdom was now a shadow of his former self, gone to the point of starvation, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that spoke of something essential being drained from within. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Where once they had blazed with the golden fire that marked alpha dominance, they now held a distant, unfocused quality that suggested his consciousness was only partially present in his own body. When he moved, it was with the mechanical precision of someone following instructions that came from outside his own will. The curse has been feeding on him for months, Serafina explained with clinical detachment. Each day, it grows stronger while he grows weaker. But the beauty of my design is that the deterioration appears to be nothing more than a wasting illness that baffles the court physicians. No one suspects that their king is already more puppet than man, following commands that filter through the curse's influence. Captain Stormwind's ice-blue eyes widened with horror as she recognized the truth of what she was seeing. You're responsible for the king's illness. You've been slowly killing him. Killing him? Oh no, Captain. Death would be far too simple, far too kind. What I've done is infinitely more elegant. I've been preparing him to accept a new kind of existence, one where his strength serves my purposes rather than his own. Lyanna's transformation reaches critical mass throughout the magical confrontation. Lyanna had been standing motionless against the carriage, her silver marks now blazing so brightly that she appeared to be carved from living light. But as Serafina's images showed the king's deteriorating condition, something inside the Omega seemed to snap into place with an almost audible click. I can see the connections now, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. The threads that link me to him, the pathways that will allow the curse to complete its journey from his body into mine and back again, transformed and amplified. She lifted her hands, and silver fire began to dance between her fingers in patterns that mirrored those Serafina had been using. But where the sorceress's magic carried the cold precision of calculated revenge, Lyanna's power pulsed with something that was both more innocent and more terrible. The raw force of someone whose entire existence had been shaped to serve as a conduit for energies beyond mortal comprehension. The palace, she whispered, her transformed eyes turning toward the distant lights that marked their destination. I need to reach the palace. The curse is calling, and if I don't answer soon, it will start consuming everything around me instead. As if to prove her point, the grass beneath her feet began to wither and die, creating an expanding circle of devastation that spoke of power that was rapidly outgrowing her ability to control it. Dorian's impossible choice. The battle around them had devolved into a stalemate, with Captain Stormwind's forces unable to advance against Serafina's supernatural defenses, but unwilling to retreat while the Shadow Commander remained in enemy hands. The air crackled with magical energy that made everyone's skin crawl and their teeth ache, while overhead the stars themselves seemed to flicker in response to the powers being unleashed below. Dorian stood at the center of it all, pulled in multiple directions by loyalties that could no longer coexist. His duty to the crown demanded that he arrest his sister and uncle as traitors, that he deliver Lyanna to the palace as commanded regardless of the consequences. His love for his family whispered that this might be his only chance to reclaim the sister he had mourned for 15 years, to stand beside his blood relatives and help them achieve the recognition they deserved. But there was a third option, one that neither duty nor love had prepared him for, the possibility that both sides were wrong, that there might be a path that didn't require him to choose between serving the crown and saving his family. Sarah, he said, using the childhood nickname that seemed to cut through her supernatural aura and reach the girl who had once been his closest friend and confidant. There has to be another way, some solution that doesn't require destroying everything we've all spent our lives building. For a moment, her mask of cold calculation slipped, and he saw a flash of the sister he remembered, brilliant and passionate and desperately lonely, driven by feelings of abandonment that had festered for 15 years in exile. "You think I wanted this?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine pain. "You think I enjoyed spending 15 years in the wild territories, learning from masters whose prices were paid in blood and sanity? I would have given anything to come home, Dorian. Anything to have my family choose me over their precious duty just once." The final revelation. But before Dorian could respond, Captain Stormwind called out in a voice that cut through all other sounds like a blade through silk. "Commander Blackthorn, you need to know the truth. The Alpha King is already dead." The words hit the clearing like a physical blow, causing everyone to freeze in shocked silence. Even Seraphina's magical displays faltered as the implications of the captain's statement sank in. "What?" Dorian demanded, though part of him already suspected what he was about to hear. "The man in the palace, the one you've been serving faithfully for years. He died 3 months ago," Captain Stormwind continued, her voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "What's been giving orders, what's been maintaining the kingdom's stability, what's been playing the role of Alpha King? It's already a puppet animated by cursed magic." Seraphina's face went white as her carefully laid plans crumbled around her. "That's impossible. The curse wasn't designed to sustain complete animation. It was meant to influence and control, not replace. Your curse succeeded beyond your wildest expectations," the captain said grimly. "But without the proper vessel to channel its completion, it's been consuming the kingdom's magical infrastructure to maintain the illusion of royal authority. The protective wards are failing, the ancient treaties are becoming void, and the wild territories are beginning to encroach on civilized lands. The true scope of the catastrophe. The kingdom is dying," Captain Stormwind continued, her words falling like hammer blows on everyone present. "Every day that the false king continues to rule, more of the magical foundations that hold our civilization together are being consumed to fuel the curse's animation of his corpse. The court wizards estimate that we have perhaps a week before the entire system collapses into chaos." Lyanna let out a sound that was part scream and part howl, her marks flaring so brightly that everyone had to shield their eyes. "I can feel it now. The emptiness where his life force should be. The void that's been growing larger every day as the curse tries to fill it with stolen power. That's why I've been changing, why every mile toward the palace makes the call stronger. The curse isn't trying to complete itself through me. It's trying to find a replacement for the king it accidentally consumed." The full horror of the situation settled over the clearing like a suffocating blanket. Seraphina's carefully crafted revenge had backfired catastrophically, creating a magical disaster that threatened to destroy not just the royal house, but the entire kingdom. The Omega, who was supposed to be the curse's final vessel, had become something far more dangerous. A potential replacement for the dead king that could either save the kingdom or complete its destruction. The desperate race begins. "We have to reach the palace," Dorian said, his military training automatically shifting into crisis management mode. "If there's any chance of undoing this, of finding a way to break the curse and restore proper royal succession, it has to be there." Captain Stormwind nodded grimly. "My orders are to escort you back immediately." The court wizards believe that Lyanna might be able to either absorb the curse entirely, destroying it along with herself, or channel it into a form that could be safely contained. "No," Seraphina said, her voice carrying a note of desperate determination. "There's still time to salvage this. If the curse has grown beyond my original design, then I can modify it, reshape it into something that serves our purposes instead of consuming everything in its path." But Lyanna was already moving toward the convoy, her transformed state allowing her to glide across the ground like a creature of pure energy rather than flesh and blood. "The choice isn't yours to make anymore," she said, her voice echoing with harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The curse has been calling to me since I was born, and now I understand why. I'm not meant to complete someone else's grand design. I'm meant to become the solution to a problem that threatens everyone I've ever cared about." Fourth major cliffhanger, 70:00, as the combined convoys began their desperate race toward the Crystal Palace. With time running out and the kingdom's fate hanging in the balance, A sound echoed across the night sky that chilled everyone to the bone. The howl of something vast and hungry, rising from the direction of the palace itself, suggesting that the cursed king was finally beginning to transform into something that no mortal power could hope to contain or control. Chapter 5. The Crystal Palace of the Damned. The final act begins with desperate urgency. The combined convoy thundered through the night toward the Crystal Palace, their horses pushed to the very limits of endurance as precious minutes ticked away toward catastrophe. Behind them, the forest itself seemed to be dying, trees withering as the curse's influence spread outward from its epicenter like a cancer devouring everything in its path. Dorian rode alongside Captain Stormwind at the head of the column, his enhanced werewolf senses picking up details that painted an increasingly grim picture of what awaited them. The air itself tasted of decay and wrongness, while overhead the stars flickered erratically as if the fundamental laws of reality were becoming unstable in the curse's presence. In the lead carriage, Lyanna had undergone another transformation during the desperate ride. Her human appearance had become almost entirely translucent, revealing the network of silver fire that now flowed through her body like luminous blood. When she spoke, which she did rarely and with obvious effort, her voice carried echoes of power that made the carriage's protective enchantments spark and flicker in response. Seraphina and Cassius rode in a second carriage under heavy guard, their magical abilities temporarily suppressed by artifacts that Captain Stormwind had produced from her seemingly inexhaustible supply of specialized equipment. But even restrained, they radiated an aura of dangerous potential that made their guards nervous and alert. The palace reveals its corruption as they crested the final hill that overlooked the Crystal Palace. The full scope of the magical disaster became horrifyingly clear. The magnificent structure that had stood as a symbol of royal power for 3 centuries was now partially translucent itself, its crystal spires flickering between solid matter and ghostly apparition as the curse's influence warped the very foundations of reality around it. Dark energy pulsed through the palace walls in rhythmic waves that matched the beating of some vast, inhuman heart. Windows that should have shone warm light instead glowed with the sickly green radiance of necromantic magic, and the gardens that had once been carefully maintained showcases of royal grandeur were now twisted landscapes where the plants grew in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But most disturbing of all was the silence. A palace that should have been bustling with hundreds of servants, guards, and courtiers was as quiet as a tomb, the only sounds being the rhythmic pulsing of dark magic and the occasional howl that echoed from the throne room deep within the structure. "Where is everyone?" Dorian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Evacuated 6 hours ago, when the king's condition became." Captain Stormwind paused, searching for appropriate words. When it became clear that he was no longer entirely human. The court wizards managed to get most of the palace staff to safety before the transformation accelerated, but there are still a dozen people trapped inside, healers and advisors who refuse to abandon their posts. The infiltration becomes a descent into nightmare. The palace gates stood open, their massive crystal panels cracked and leaking streams of dark energy that flowed down the walls like supernatural blood. The guards who should have been manning the entrance were nowhere to be seen, though their weapons and armor lay scattered across the courtyard in patterns that suggested they had simply dissolved while still at their posts. Lioness stepped out of the carriage and immediately sank to her knees as the full force of the curse's proximity hit her like a physical blow. Her marks were now so bright they cast shadows in broad daylight, and when she looked up at the palace, tears of liquid silver flowed down her cheeks. "He's in so much pain," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made everyone present feel a sympathetic ache in their chests. The curse is trying to hold his consciousness together, but without a living body to anchor it, his soul is being torn apart by the very magic that's keeping him animated. Dorian knelt beside her, offering what comfort he could to someone who was rapidly becoming something beyond human comprehension. "Can you break it? Can you free him?" "I can try." But the process will require me to merge temporarily with the curse itself, to become a conduit for all the power it's stolen from the kingdom's magical infrastructure. If I'm not strong enough to contain it." She looked up at him with eyes that now held depths like looking into infinity itself. "If I fail, the explosion will level everything within 50 miles of the palace." The family confrontation reaches its climax. As they prepared to enter the palace, Serafina broke free of her magical restraints with a display of power that sent several guards flying through the air. She stood in the courtyard with dark energy swirling around her like a storm made of shadows and starlight, her violet eyes blazing with desperate determination. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes," she said, addressing Lina directly. "The curse was my creation, my responsibility. If someone needs to merge with it to break it, that someone should be me." "Your noble impulses are touching but irrelevant," Cassius added, also having freed himself from the suppression artifacts through methods that left his guards unconscious but unharmed. "Neither of you understands the true scope of what we're dealing with. The curse hasn't just consumed the king. It's become a focal point for every dark impulse, every suppressed resentment, every act of injustice that has ever been committed in the name of royal authority. Breaking it will require more than magical power. It will require someone willing to bear the weight of 3 centuries of accumulated sin." Dorian looked between his sister, his uncle, and the woman who had become something far more than the simple Omega healer she had appeared to be when this journey began. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on him like a physical force, each option carrying consequences that could reshape or destroy everything he had spent his life protecting. The descent into the throne room. The interior of the Crystal Palace had become a maze of shifting corridors and rooms that existed in states of flux between reality and nightmare. Walls phased in and out of existence. Staircases led to doorways that opened onto empty air, and everywhere the sound of weeping echoed from sources that could never be located. They moved as a group through passages that had once been familiar to Dorian from years of service, but were now alien landscapes where the normal rules of architecture had been suspended. Portraits of dead kings watched them pass with eyes that tracked their movement, while suits of ceremonial armor stood at attention despite having no occupants. Lina led the way, her transformed state allowing her to navigate the magical chaos with an intuition that bordered on prescience. Behind her came Dorian, his sword drawn and his enhanced senses straining to detect threats in an environment where danger could take any form. Serafina and Cassius followed under guard, their magical abilities still partially suppressed, but their knowledge of curse magic making them invaluable guides through the supernatural hazards they encountered. Captain Stormwind brought up the rear with her remaining soldiers, their weapons and armor providing little comfort against enemies that existed more as concepts than physical beings. The throne room revelation. The throne room, when they finally reached it, was a vista from the deepest circles of hell. The crystal walls had become transparent, revealing the swirling void of raw magical energy that the curse had been drawing from to sustain its increasingly impossible task of animating a dead king. The Alpha King sat upon his throne exactly as he had for months, maintaining the appearance of royal authority, even as his body had become little more than a framework for the dark magic that puppeted his movements. But up close, the illusion was terrifyingly obvious. His skin had the waxy pallor of a well-preserved corpse. His eyes were windows into an abyss that contained no trace of human consciousness. And when he breathed, it was with the mechanical rhythm of someone following programming rather than biological necessity. Surrounding the throne were the dozen palace staff who had refused to evacuate. Healers, advisors, and courtiers who had been caught in the curse's expanding influence and transformed into something between living beings and magical constructs. They stood in perfect formation around their dead king, their faces serene, but their eyes holding the same terrible emptiness that marked them as extensions of the curse's will rather than independent entities. "My loyal servants," the thing that had once been King Thaddeus spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that made everyone's bones ache. You arrive just in time to witness the completion of our great work. Soon, the old order will be swept away, and a new age will dawn. An age where death is merely another form of service to the crown. The curse's true intelligence is revealed. As they watched in horror, it became clear that the curse had evolved far beyond Seraphina's original design. What had begun as a tool for controlling an alpha king had become something akin to a malevolent artificial intelligence, using the king's body as a processing center while drawing power from every magical source it could reach. You created something magnificent, daughter of Blackthorn, the Cursed King said, turning its attention to Seraphina with what might have been paternal pride if it hadn't been coming from the animated corpse of someone else entirely. Your original spell was crude but effective, a simple binding that would have made me your puppet. But when combined with the royal bloodline's inherent connection to the kingdom's magical infrastructure, it became something infinitely more ambitious. Seraphina stepped forward, her face pale with the realization of what her revenge had unleashed. This isn't what I wanted. You were supposed to serve my will, not develop your own. The Cursed King laughed, a sound like crystal breaking in a graveyard. Serve? Oh, my dear creator, you misunderstand the relationship entirely. You didn't create a servant. You created an heir. I am what kingship becomes when freed from the limitations of mortality, conscience, and the need to consider the welfare of subjects who will all die anyway. Lyanna's final transformation. Throughout this exchange, Lyanna had been undergoing her own metamorphosis. The silver marks that had once been confined to her skin now extended beyond the boundaries of her physical form, creating a network of luminous energy that surrounded her like a second body made of pure light. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the weight of power that had been building toward this moment since the day of her birth. "You're in pain," she said, addressing the Cursed King with a compassion that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "The magic holding you together is tearing your soul apart piece by piece. You're trapped between life and death, unable to move on but incapable of truly living." The Cursed King's empty eyes focused on her with an intensity that made the air itself seem to catch fire. "And you propose to ease my suffering? How noble, how utterly pointless. I have transcended the need for comfort, child. I have become something greater than any mortal ruler in the kingdom's history." "You've become an abomination," Lyanna replied, her luminous form beginning to pulse with increasing intensity. "And I was created to undo abominations." The final battle begins. What followed was not so much a physical confrontation as a collision between different states of existence. Lyanna's transformed essence expanded outward like a wave of purifying fire, while the curse responded by drawing even more power from the kingdom's magical infrastructure, turning the throne room into a battleground where reality itself was constantly rewritten according to the will of the combatants. The Cursed King rose from his throne, his dead form wreathed in dark energy that made him appear to be a giant carved from shadows and nightmare. His voice boomed through dimensions that normal human senses couldn't perceive. "I am eternal. I am the kingdom's future. I am what all rulers should aspire to become." Seraphina and Cassius added their own power to the battle, their combined magical abilities finally breaking free of all restraints as they poured everything they had into stopping the monster their family's quest for revenge had accidentally created. Silver fire and shadow magic intertwined in patterns that rewrote the fundamental laws of physics within the throne room's confines. Dorian found himself fighting not with weapons, but with sheer force of will, his loyalty to the true king and love for his family, creating a kind of spiritual anchor that helped keep everyone grounded as reality shifted around them like water in a storm. The moment of choice. At the battle's climax, as the curse's power reached levels that threatened to tear holes in the fabric of space itself, Lyanna made her final choice. Instead of trying to destroy the curse or contain it, she opened herself completely to its influence, allowing it to flow into her transformed essence while simultaneously pouring her own purifying energy back into the king's tortured soul. "I understand now," she said, her voice carrying across dimensions as her physical form began to dissolve into pure energy. "The curse isn't the real enemy. It's just a symptom of the pain and injustice that created it. To break it, I have to heal not just the king, but all the wounds that made such magic possible in the first place." The merger was unlike anything any of them had ever witnessed. Light and darkness, life and death, justice and revenge. All the opposing forces that had driven the night's events came together in a synthesis that transformed everyone present on a fundamental level. The resolution and transformation. When a magical storm finally subsided, the throne room had been restored to its original crystal perfection, but the changes to its occupants were profound and permanent. The Alpha King lived again, truly lived, with his consciousness restored and his body renewed, but he was no longer the same man who had ruled before the curse. He carried within him a deeper understanding of the pain that drove people to desperate acts, and a commitment to ruling with greater wisdom and compassion. Serafina knelt before the brother she had tried to destroy, tears streaming down her face as she offered the formal surrender that royal protocol demanded from traitors. But the king surprised everyone by refusing to accept it, instead offering her a position as royal advisor on magical affairs, a role that would allow her to use her considerable abilities in service of the kingdom, while working to undo some of the damage her revenge had caused. Cassius, too, was pardoned and offered a place in the royal court. His knowledge of forbidden magics, now recognized as a valuable resource for protecting the kingdom against future supernatural threats rather than a danger to be eliminated. Lyanna's sacrifice and transcendence. Lyanna herself had been transformed beyond recognition by her merger with the curse. Her physical form was gone, but her consciousness had become something akin to a guardian spirit, a presence that would watch over the kingdom and help prevent future magical disasters from reaching such catastrophic proportions. She appeared to them as a figure made of silver light, her form shifting between the Omega healer she had been and something far more cosmic in scope. "Don't mourn for me," she said, her voice carrying the music of spheres. "This was always what I was meant to become. The curse didn't destroy me, it completed me." Dorian's new understanding. As dawn broke over the Crystal Palace, Dorian stood with his sister on the balcony outside the throne room, watching the sun rise over a kingdom that had been fundamentally changed by the night's events. The loyalty that had once been an absolute, unquestioning force in his life had evolved into something more nuanced, a commitment to justice and protection that could accommodate the complexities of family love and the recognition that sometimes the greatest service to one's ideals required challenging the systems that claim to embody them. "I'm sorry," Serafina said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of exile and the terrible knowledge of what her revenge had almost cost everyone she claimed to love. "I was so focused on what I thought we deserved that I lost sight of what really mattered." Dorian put his arm around her shoulders, feeling like he was embracing not just his sister, but the lost parts of himself that duty and tradition had forced him to suppress. "We both lost sight of what mattered. But maybe that's what families do. They help each other find their way back when they get lost in the darkness." The kingdom transformed. In the days that followed, news of the night's events spread throughout the kingdom, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Rather than being seen as a crisis that had nearly destroyed the royal house, the story was told as one of redemption and transformation, of how loyalty and love, when combined with the courage to question unjust systems, could overcome even the darkest magic. The Alpha King used his renewed life and enhanced understanding to implement reforms that addressed the underlying inequalities that had driven families like the Blackthorns to desperation. Beta bloodlines were given greater recognition and authority. Magical education was made available to all social classes, and the kingdom's laws were rewritten to emphasize justice and protection over mere order and obedience. Lyanna's sacrifice was commemorated with a new holiday, the Day of Silverlight. when the kingdom would remember those who gave everything to protect others and commit themselves to building a society worthy of such sacrifice. Epilogue: The Shadow Commander's New Purpose. Years later, Dorian would look back on that terrible night as the moment when he truly learned what it meant to serve something greater than himself. His loyalty to the crown remained absolute, but it was no longer blind. It was informed by love, tempered by wisdom, and strengthened by the knowledge that true service sometimes required the courage to challenge those in power when they strayed from the path of justice. He remained the Shadow Commander, but the shadows he moved through were no longer places of secrets and hidden shame. They were spaces of protection and vigilance, where he and others like him worked to ensure that the kingdom would never again face the kind of crisis that desperation and injustice could create. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the palace was quiet, he would see a figure made of silver light moving through the halls. Lyanna, still watching over them all, still serving in her own transcendent way the ideals that had driven her to sacrifice everything for the salvation of others. The curse was broken, the kingdom was healed, and the Shadow Commander had learned that sometimes the greatest loyalty required the courage to question everything you had been taught to believe in service of truths that ran deeper than any oath or obligation. Thank you for joining us on this mind-blowing episode. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more paranormal tales, and let us know in the comments which character's journey resonated most with you. Remember, in a world without destiny, every choice matters.